Because, as Locke says, for nobody can transfer to another, including government, nobody can transfer to another more power than he has himself, and nobody has a power to take away the property of another. In other words, you all understand that what is yours is yours. No one has a right to it. You can give anything away, you can trade it, you can sell it, but no one has a right to it but you. No one can take your car, or your air conditioner, or your Game Boy, and give it away. Well, if government's powers are derived from the consent of the people, and the people never had any right to take away what belongs to another, government may not do likewise. In other words, the principle of property precludes any public transfer of wealth. It is morally, righteously precluded. The shorthand way of saying that is government is designed to be a protector. It may not become a provider. Say it like this: if liberty is mainly consumed in labor, and the fruit of our labor is our property, then any public transfer of wealth is an act of theft under cover of law. Fundamental principles are so critical, and our founding principles are most critical of all, because fundamental principles, founding principles, state fundamental truths and answer fundamental questions. What, and these are questions that no one asks today, what is government for? What must government do for us? What must we be allowed and expected to do for ourselves and one another? When must a people say to government this far and not one step farther in terms of power exercised? Now, if you understand that much, and that's a lot of stuff that I've already given you, but if you understand that much, then you can determine the precise moment in our history when government veered off course, and how we got from that moment to this, from that day to this. And that I'm going to explain right now. Because unfortunately, the founding principles did not outlive the founding era. Not once George Washington decided to make Alexander Hamilton his Secretary of Treasury. I trace the origins of the American welfare state to the second bill signed into law by our first president, the Tariff Act of 1789. It, by the way, that's the day the establishment came to town. The establishment we're all rail against today, thank heavens. And establishment is nothing but the welfare state. Corporate welfare, social welfare, two species of the same phenomenon. The Tariff Act of 1789, the moment Congress met in the spring of 1789, it was deluged with memorials, pleas for tariff protection from our young manufacturers. A tariff is simply a tax placed on goods coming from abroad. Domestic manufacturers wanted these tariffs, which would allow them to raise their prices behind these tariff walls. Wonderful for the manufacturers, make more profits than they otherwise would because of less competition. Politically mandated less competition. If you were a Western farmer, if you were a Southern planter, you had to buy all of your tools, your utensils, your weapons, every manufactured good you needed at artificially higher prices while selling your produce at a price that the market will bear. And if there was a bumper harvest that year, you might not even make back your expenses of planting and harvesting, but everything you bought was at a higher price. If you were a seaport merchant, your ships very often were lying idle at their wharfs. Because if Europe was not able to sell their goods in this country, they didn't have the resources to buy our mainly agricultural products, which were shipped above the seas. So if you were a merchant, your ships were at the wharf. If you were a seaman making your living in the maritime trades, you were unemployed. You were out of work. Again, welfare. It's not a direct public transfer, but it's a public policy that benefited some Americans at other Americans' expense. And to me, that is the definition of welfare. So it includes far more than just the anti-poverty programs. How did we get from that early day to this? I'm going to repeat this twice. It's the overriding principle that explains the rise and growth of the American welfare state. Once a nation decides that some of its citizens have a right not to go out and get, but to lobby Congress and be given, it finds itself torn by two questions. Well, who else should get, and how much should they all be given? There's only one answer: politics. Hence, the rise of the special interest organizations and all of their lobbyists and all of their lawyers. And today we live in a country where the political class lives in the lap of luxury while the rest of the country languishes under heavy taxes, the burden of cost of complying with an ever-mounting number of regulations of every description, so much so that the 7 most wealthiest counties in our country border Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland, and so forth. And the welfare state rose simply on the contradiction of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington's agreement against Jefferson's advice, against Madison's advice regarding the protective tariff and the Bank of the United States, the First National Bank, and all other manner of subsidies that came down the pike in the early 19th century. Worst of all were the transportation subsidies. I just finished a book where I discussed the fact that it was precisely the issuance of corporate welfare that created all of the crises for which the progressives responded with the need for social welfare. Minimum wage, maximum hours, Social Security, all the rest. In other words, it was precisely the violation of Jeffersonian principle, of Lockean principle to begin with, that themselves created the crises that caused the complaints against so-called capitalism, which was never allowed to be practiced. Free market capitalism was never allowed to be practiced, and it was precisely the contradictions and the violations of the free market and of human liberty that led to all of the crises, like the Panic of 1819, of 1836, the Panic of 1856, the Panic of 1873, which ushered in an 8-year depression in this country and gave fodder to all of the European Marxist ideas and raised all of the labor unrest that led to the progressive legislation by Woodrow Wilson's day. So, I've come now to my plan to save this country, to restore prosperity and opportunity on a permanent basis, and to retrieve the founders' original vision of liberty at the same time. And what it will take, in my view, is not a demand for a flat tax, or a fair tax, or term limit laws, or a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, or Mark Levin's cost project, his Article 5 solution. These are all non sequiturs. These are all non-fundamental issues. They are mere policy debates that will take forever. In my opinion, the only solution to save this country is to return to the founders' philosophy of liberty and defend it and proclaim it and fight for it by not doing as the Tea Party has been doing, talking about liberty, and as I've been doing until now, because Americans are not interested in liberty. They are not interested in the founding philosophy. They are ordinary people who simply want to live their lives and escape the burden of taxes that's around their neck and the costs of complying, and offer opportunity like there used to be in this country for their children to have careers, professions, and climb up the ladder of success that they did and their parents did and their parents before them. So you can't talk about liberty. I'm afraid, I believe it's one of the reasons why the Tea Party as such never received the traction it deserved and should have had. It's talking over the heads of most Americans. Americans like common sense, and that's the secret of Donald Trump's success. He talks to people on their level, more so than his son Eric or his son Donald Jr., who gave fantastic speeches at the convention. But their language is not going to reach the guy on the street. The guy on the street is concerned, as I say, with taxes, with budget deficits, with an accumulated national debt that will soon surpass $20 trillion. And that is a real debt that every man, woman, and child in this country will have to pay back for years to come, and will take so much more of their earnings. These are the nitty-gritty things. And Americans also detest the corruption that Washington, D.C. represents. It is why not just Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, but Bernie Sanders as well attracted such popular support. Exposing the corruption that Washington represents, the special interests who live in the lap of luxury, as I say, while the rest of the country languishes. So, what's the solution? I think it is to enter the national debate where it is now. The understanding that the establishment is corrupt from top to bottom. And the establishment politicians, both Democrat and Republican, are parties to that corruption, trading favors for campaign donations and all the rest of it. Americans are right to rise up against the corruption that the establishment represents. But that establishment, as Mark Levin tells us every single night, is simply another name for crony capitalism. It's another name for corporate welfare. My idea is to merge the corrupt idea of corporate welfare with the devastating idea of social welfare, to change the thinking of our citizens to understand that all forms of welfare are counterproductive, wildly destructive, and need to be attacked and obliterated root and branch. So that welfare is not just the anti-poverty programs, that welfare is all of it. It now represents 80% of the federal budget. So when I say a movement against welfare as such, a grassroots welfare revolt, will in time, over time, gradually but steadily, allow for a 75% cut in federal spending without cutting any essential services, because government still is what we need government to be, our protector. And I agree with Donald Trump. We need to strongly bolster our national defense, spend more money than what we have now, and reverse the decline, the decay of our armed forces. So I'm generous in saying we can cut spending 75%. But right now, today, if you add up government services acting as our protector, including the armed forces, the FBI, the system of criminal justice, the system of civil justice, all of the judges and jails and penitentiaries that we have, all of that represents well under 20 cents of every dollar Washington spends each year. You can look up the budget in brief. I've been following this for decades, and it's unvarying. It hasn't changed. So we can cut all of that spending. And I would say, by way of arguing, social welfare harms most the able-bodied men and women it pretends to help. That liberal compassion, get this, consigns able-bodied men and women to an effort-free wonderland of stigmatized indigence. No thank you. Corporate welfare helps the connected and the corrupt, but harms us all. At a time when Puerto Rico nearly went bankrupt this month, earlier this month, when Detroit is already bankrupt, when San Bernardino, California, has also declared bankruptcy, Atlantic City is right on the verge, and it doesn't seem to be getting help. We got Detroit. Chicago is on the verge, and New York State, the state, is not in any great shape. Upstate is economically devastated. And so this is a time when more Americans can be expected to begin feeling the problems that we have and feeling the anxiety. I have believed, and I've been saying for over 30 years, that Americans will remain apathetic as long as they can, but when their backs are against the wall, when they really see so clearly the impact, the deleterious impact of government on their lives, they will wake up. The Tea Party movement proved that to me in 2010 and again in 2014, and Donald Trump's movement is proving that in spades today for all of us. I would love to see the Tea Party be the vanguard of a new movement for liberty, but the movement of liberty, in my view, has to begin as a grassroots welfare revolt to show the establishment politicians of both parties the door and build a tidal wave of Tea Party patriotism in this country. Eventually, this movement against welfare will raise and resolve every important question, including the questions of liberty, including the questions of defending our rights to be free. And let me just finish by saying, well, two things. First of all, if you ask me what welfare is, it is pork, bacon, earmarks, member items, constituent services, farm subsidies, protective tariffs, business bailouts, and the growing gaggle of entitlements that are overwhelming our fiscal house in order. So what's the solution? In a word, let's do to DC, let conservatism do to DC what liberalism did to Detroit. Just depopulate the place. Thank you very much.
Opening up to answers and question and answers, please.
I'd like to send a question I asked you before.
Okay.
I know that Locke did say life, liberty, and property. Why did Jefferson change property to pursuit of happiness?
Okay, there are two reasons, basically, that we now understand. First of all, there was a Swiss jurist named Jean-Jacques Burle-Marquis, who was one of the most eminent Lockean jurists of the 18th century, of the mid-18th century. And he made a distinction that stuck. He believed there were fundamental natural rights and also propitious natural rights. A propitious natural right is something that, given the nature of this world after the fall, people have as natural rights. But there is a more fundamental right that gives rise to these secondary rights. And the more fundamental right, Burle-Marquis said, was the pursuit of happiness. Also, that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, while I can't find it in Locke's political writings, is all over his writings on epistemology and morality. So that Locke speaks very clearly of our right to pursue our happiness in his essay concerning human understanding. That's one reason. The second reason is property was a very loaded concept at a time when there was slavery, because every southern plantation owner simply regarded his dogs, his plowshares, and his slaves as his property. Jefferson was very sensitive to that. Jefferson tried to include in the Declaration of abolishing of poverty, that he, of slavery, that he attributed to King George's policies and everything, but that was stricken, and we would not have had a revolution or a constitution. And so that is the very dicey reason why Jefferson took property out and replaced it with